I'm Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these.
Hello, hello. You're going to have to tell me if
You can't hear me because my mic is having some technical issues, so I apologize for being late. Today, we are going to talk about the Denisovan Homo sapien hybrid, otherwise known as the Hamites. These were the urban builders, the hydrologists, the technologists, long before Greco Roman or Indo European contact. We're going to talk about Ham's sons, specifically Cush, who went into Ethiopia and the Sudan, Nubia, Mizraim, who went into Kemet, that we know as Egypt, Phut, who went into Libya or Maghreb, and Canaan, who went into the Levant, into Phoenicia, the Jebusites, those people, right? Their migrations went through the Nile corridor. They went into Mesopotamia, south into Central Africa, west into the Sahel before the desertification, and north into the Levant. So before we get into it, let's say hello to some people. Adric is here first. He says it's on. Adrian says, let's go. Auntie is here. Hi with the peace sign. Cynical Optimist is here. Peace to you as well. Leon is here. Spain Man is here. And for those of you watching in the clouds, oh, and you can hear me. Thank you. For those of you watching from the clouds, feel free to say hello. This is the best live tribe on YouTube. And shout out to the replay gang. So let's get into it. And you know I like to bring receipts. You know that I like to bring receipts. So let's get into it. This might be a little bit of a long one. Okay. But these are the technologists. Okay. Hi, Keeping Up with the Joneses. Okay, so what if the most advanced technologies of the ancient world weren't lost? My dog is in here making noise, sorry. They were buried on purpose. What if the people you were taught were cursed were actually the keepers of Earth's original matrix systems? So we're going to talk about the story of Ham, the technologist of the human bloodline covenant, and the truth that they tried to erase. So who was Ham? Let's talk about that. Okay, so the sons of Noah, we've talked about that before, and they had 3 inherited roles. They weren't given to populate an entire nation of people. They were given nations of people, okay? Shem is the spiritual line, right? The mystics, the witnesses, the prophets, the shaman, right? Japheth was supposed to be about infrastructure, right? Builder, those kind of things, architects. Ham is the technology line, the engineers and the earth scientists, okay? Ham's children, Cush, we just talked about that, of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Nubia. Mizraim, which is Kemet, or Egypt as we know it. Phut, Libya, Canaan, the Levant, the Phoenician ports, those kind of things. So the curse of Ham was a fabrication, okay? After the flood, Noah became drunk. So you pull out your Bibles if you got them, okay? After the flood, Noah becomes drunk and lies naked, uncovered in his tent, okay? He's drunk, he's naked, right? We can imagine this. His son Ham sees his nakedness, okay? We all remember this part. So while Shem and Japheth cover Noah up respectfully, right? Then we get this really confusing verse. Noah says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." Genesis 9:25, if you want to check my work. Cursed be Canaan. Who was Canaan? Well, that's Ham's son. Okay. So Ham is the one who sees Noah naked, but the curse is placed on Ham's son, Canaan. Huh. Here's my take on it. Look, Grandpa was drunk, okay, and naked, not in his right mind. He was embarrassed about his state, and he got irritated at someone, just because he's drunk and irritated, who wasn't even in the room. He confused Ham with Canaan. That's his kid. They look alike, right? It wasn't even a real curse. It wasn't all your descendants for all of time, forever. And it was, screw you, Canaan. You're going to be your brother's servant. It's just some goofy thing from a drunken man. Canaan is just one of Ham's 4 sons. Okay, so this isn't even the curse of Ham. Okay, yet only Canaan got this curse, not from God, from Noah. Okay, not Cush, who was Ethiopia, not Mizraim, who was Egypt, or Phut, who was Libya. Okay, the myth really was crafted in the 15th to 18th century to justify slavery. They said, so we all, everybody read their Bibles and they saw that it was Canaan, specifically himself, not all the descendants, who Noah was pissed at, even though he wasn't even in the room. But when people wanted to justify slavery, they retold the story and said that it was the curse of Ham. It was all Hamites forever in perpetuity who were to be enslaved, to be the servant of servants. So it was a fabrication. It was a lie. It was an absolute lie. Okay. So what they did was calling the enslaved people Canaanites. By the way, that's how they were referred. They were Gentiles. They were also called pagans. So they could use this curse to justify what they were doing. Early rabbinic texts and Ethiopian traditions never told it that way. Never said this was the curse of Ham. This was a specific thing where Noah was pissed at Canaan for what Ham did, which still doesn't make sense. Ham sees his dad naked and he's like, "Hey, brothers, let's take care of dad. He's acting crazy," but somehow, right? But this is a drunken man. Oh, I'm sorry, I went too far ahead. Okay. So empire theology, the elitists, whatever you want to call it, twisted this passage in 2 very particular ways. Okay. One, they said all of Ham's descendants, right, were cursed, especially anybody from Africa, right, or even looked African, even though the Bible never said that and it was never taught that way. They equated blackness or being melanated with that divine punishment. Okay. Building this false racial hierarchy. It wasn't ever scriptural. It was political the whole time. Okay. European colonialists during the transatlantic slave trade. So think about, this is 1600 years later. Or no, even longer than that, because this is Noah. This is however many thousands of years, depending on what you believe, right? Used that during the transatlantic slave trade to justify enslaving anybody who was Black. The curse of Canaan was rebranded as a racial curse and used to define Africans as natural slaves. And it was rebranded to the curse of Ham. Okay. In Ethiopian tradition, Ham was never cursed. Okay. Ethiopia is described as a land of kings, engineers, and spiritual power. In Hamitic cosmology, no such curse exists at all. Hamitic cultures describe a divine right to build and shape reality. They are the technologists. They will tell you themselves. Okay. The curse narrative is absent in early Semitic writings and appears to gain traction primarily during Greek and Roman occupation of Jewish lands, when the theology began aligning with the empire. It was a fabrication. Then it's picked up and gone global during the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so what did the Hamites inherit? Technology. They'll tell you themselves, right? Technology. So, civilization. So, they were not the philosophers, they were not the architects. I'm not saying they couldn't do those things, okay? They were the engineers of reality. That's what they tell you. This line was gifted with, hi, Rael. This line was gifted with knowledge to do hydrological systems. They made aquifers and canal systems in Kemet and Kush. They use sound and vibration technology. And there's even reports of acoustic levitation of stone. Maybe that's how they built the pyramids. Sonic frequency chambers, those kind of things, all has to do with the Great Pyramids. Metallurgy and alchemy. They did gold purification, iron smithing, mercury use. This was in Nok and in Kush. They used medical precision, Chemedian surgical tools. They had anatomy scrolls. They even were doing cranial surgery. They had time systems, which were lunar and solar star calendars that predate Rome or Greece. And they had 0 point knowledge, okay, which this is metaphysical tech encoded in mythology. This is like the Dogon, okay, who talk about the Sirius planets, okay? So let's talk about the Dogon because these are recent people, recent, that we're learning about in modern times, okay? So the Dogon. The Dogon, to me, are a pristine example of Ham's technological inheritance. The earthbound mastery that they have governed by their sacred order and deeply tied to their celestial intelligence. This is science, okay? The Dogon hold precise ancient knowledge of the Sirius star system, particularly Sirius A, which is visible to the naked eye, Sirius B, which is a white dwarf invisible without a modern telescope. The Dogon don't have them. And a third hypothesized star, Sirius C, which they call Emaya or Aya, which is also what people call Enki. And that is mentioned in Dogon cosmology. Hi, Addo Art. So they knew Sirius B's 50-year elliptical orbit around Sirius A. Okay, so when European people had to get in everybody's business and discovered the Dogon, they found this out. Okay, they knew that it was small, dense, and heavy. Okay, that was accurate in modern physics. They knew the presence of Saturn's rings and Jupiter's moons, and that the Earth rotates on an axis and that all the planets orbit the sun. This knowledge was passed down orally with no written language or telescopic tools at all. Okay? It is not, as the Europeans first thought, that they somehow learned it from some random wandering white guy who just told them, because how could they figure it out on their own? Some random wandering white guy, because, you know, all white people have a deep and meaningful understanding of all astronomy and cosmology. I didn't know anything about the serious stuff. It could be, probably is, retention of pre-cataclysmic Atlantean Chemetian knowledge. Could be extraterrestrial or otherworldly contact or even ethereal heavenly contact. This is what they say in their temples is exactly where they got the knowledge from. And it is an unbroken Hamitic scientific priesthood tied to Kemet and Punt. Okay, so the Dogon work with iron, copper, and sacred forging techniques. They view blacksmiths as spiritual technologists. Okay, they are the makers of reality and ritual. They use ritual architecture and astronomical alignments. They have tools and They process diagrams encoded in their myths, right? They don't just call them blueprints. Their science is their religion. Their sacred forges, metal forges, are temples of transformation. They're not industrial, but they refer to it like spiritual tech. It's a hybrid. This is quintessential Hamite mastery, technology in service to people and divine balance. So, architecture is their cosmic blueprint. The Dogon villages mimic the human body, the Milky Way, and the cosmic womb. This is how they set the whole thing up. Their granaries and their dwellings align with celestial rhythms used to track time, weather, and fertility cycles. Their Nomo shrines, which the Nomo are the ones who came to talk to them extraterrestrially or heavenly, their Nomo shrines are shaped to invoke primordial archetypes, blending biology, cosmology, and technology all together. These structures are encoded data houses, right? Like you can learn lessons from the structures. They're not just a home, okay? Now, Western academics often treat Dogon cosmology as a coincidence, even though the Dogon taught the Europeans about Sirius B. They thought it was all myth and ha-ha, woo-woo, whatnot, until they discovered with their high-powered telescopes that Sirius B actually exists. Okay, so it's not coincidental. Western academics thought it was fabricated or was from contact from Europeans, even though there's literally no evidence of that whatsoever, because, again, random wandering white guy knows everything about, astronomy. They also thought it was a primitive myth, despite it being scientifically accurate. And they actually had more information than what the Europeans has. But this mimics the pattern of empire erasure of Hamite brilliance. Ra'el says, yeah, from what I've been reading, the architecture of old was in tune with the biology of the people, and they possessed tech that allowed healing to take place through breathing in the air. Breathing the air, I'm going to add also sound technology. That's what we talk about, resonance rooms and things like that. So end of the day, the Dogon are a living, current remnant of an unbroken Hamitic technological genius, possibly preserving pre-flood tech memory. And they are aligned with Shem in earlier epochs of peace. They knew the Shemites. They are the black technologists grounded in the earth, governed by the stars. They are the builders without creating an empire and colonizing everybody. They're scientists without needing the machines. It's kind of a whisper of what the world could have been without this conquest. Okay? But if we're going to talk technology, we have to talk Kemet, right? We have to talk Kemet. Okay? This is why we have to talk Kemet and why I waited until the Hamite show to do this. Because I've already talked Japheth line, I've talked Shem line. So this is the third line, and we have to talk about Kemet because this is what happens when the three lines are united. We get Kemet. Okay? Kemet wasn't just Ham's glory, although Ham's line were the pharaohs at the height of Kemet, right? They were the rulers of Kemet. But this is a time when all three bloodlines aligned. And it was the last time as well, unfortunately. So the Hamites, through Mizraim, built Kemet with technology. They had water clocks, granite cuts. So they had machinery that they made, right? They had power centers. Everything was aligned to electromagnetic ley lines and alignments, right? The Shemites, which is the prophetic priest line, right? They maintained the divine memory. They had initiation temples, right? They did services there. Philosophers came and studied under these prophet priests, right? And then the Japhites were the Hittites, right? This is the early Indo European settlers. They helped build large scale urban infrastructure. They are architectures. You can see why, with being architects and knowing infrastructure and being good at that, that they can use that for evil and turn it into colonizing. Okay. And later they want to call it gentrifying. It's all the same thing. Okay. Kemet's fall, Kemet's fall began when empire severed spirit from the structure. This kind of started with Moses. Japheth's line overran Shem's line. This is the Arabic takeover, okay? And Ham's tech was militarized instead of harmonized. So that's why we get the fall, okay? When Ham's tech falls into empire's hands, we have a problem. Rome stole and rebranded Hamitic knowledge. Why do you think we're constantly questioning how any of this happened? How did they build the pyramids? How did they do this? What room is for that? Why is this here? Because they stole what they could and then said we didn't need to know the rest. So now nobody knows. So they stole and rebranded Hamitic knowledge. The Jesuits and the Knights Templar took the Commission texts and technology and hid them in their vaults. Okay. So I just put up a video this week. Can't remember what day it was. I think on the 4th or the 5th. No, it was the 5th, about the CIA and the Knights Templar. You should watch that because it is a show about Ham's technology holding Shem's prophecy and how it got stolen by the Knights Templar. So many Greek thinkers openly credited Kemet as the source of their knowledge. What we now call Western philosophy, mathematics, and science, and we give all the credit to the Greeks, they gave all the credit to Kemet. It's a rebranded lineage of Kemetic thought, filtered, repackaged, whitewashed, especially after the Roman conquest. Okay. So Kemet was the original school. It was the original mystery school. It was the global school. Everybody wanted to go learn in Kemet. And it was a rite of passage. It was something to brag about if you went to study in Kemet. Ancient Kemet was the intellectual, spiritual, and technological power center of the ancient world globally. The Per-Ankh, which is the House of Life, was not just a temple, it was a university, a library, a laboratory, a sacred academy. It was the first university. And that was Kemet. That's the Hamites. Okay. Admission to study in Kemet required initiates to spend 10 or more years learning geometry, astronomy, sacred speech, which was the Medo Neter, ethics, governance, and metaphysics. Your pre-work to be able to go study in Kemet was 10 years of study and other stuff. You're getting your PhD in Kemet. Thank you, Vincent. Yes, yes. So Plato writes in Timaeus and Critias that Egyptian priests told Solon that the Greeks were like children who knew nothing of the past. So the Kemetians are saying the Greeks are too young to know anything. Students of Kemet include, but this is just a small list, Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates, Thales of Miletus, Herodotus, Anaxander, Diodorus Siculus. These are all people that led to our Western knowledge. They all got it from Kemet. That's where they studied. And they were out loud and proud about it. I mean, they were proud about it. Yeah, Ross says 10 years of prerequisite knowledge is beast mode. But it is kind of like you go to Kemet to get your PhD. This is your higher level degree. Now, even when you go, like as an example, it was either Pythagoras or Plato, but I'm pretty sure it was Pythagoras, studied in Kemet for 12 years after doing all this other study. And then he came back. Yes, it was him. Then he came back and developed a theory. It wasn't a theory of harmonics that he got from Kemet. Was using math to create sounds. So harmony and harmonizing, harmonics, all of that Pythagoras created, he got it from Kemet. Okay. So when does the suppression begin? So when Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, before the Common Era, it didn't just gain territory. It began the systematic erasure of Kemetic legacy. So what are the things that changed under Roman control? Kemetic temples were looted, libraries burned or absorbed into Roman holdings. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed, likely multiple times. This happened multiple times, but Rome's involvement in destroying the Library of Alexandria is significant. Christianity became the state religion, okay, eventually, and pagan African knowledge was demonized. Greek texts were preserved while ancient records in the language of Medu Neter were suppressed or destroyed. This was everybody got to talk in Latin. That was their language. So Roman Catholic institutions would later canonize Greek interpretations, strip them of any Egyptian credit, and declare Greek knowledge the Western origin of thought. Yes, the New World Order. Hi, Rami. Thank you for being here. So even as knowledge was stolen, echoes of Kemet remained in alchemy, right? Which is from the word Kemet, alchemia, alchemia, alchemy, right? Chemistry. The word chemistry comes from Kemet. The Hermetic traditions, right, which were attributed to Thoth and Hermes Trismegistus. So this is all the mystery traditions. And then Latinized names of Egyptian gods. So we have Amun, who became Jupiter Amun. Like everything is being absorbed and rebranded. Yet modern education teaches that Western civilization began with Greece, even though Greek civilization began with Kemet. Okay, so let's look at these direct quotes. Okay, direct quotes. Herodotus, this is from Histories, Book 2. The Egyptians were the first to discover the solar year, and I am of the opinion that the Greeks learned it from them. From Plato in the work Timaeus. You Hellenes, that's what they called themselves, the Greeks, are always children. You have no belief rooted in old tradition and no knowledge hoary with age. Now, Plato studied in Kemet. Diodorus Siculus in the Library of History, Book 1. The Egyptians say that the Greeks adopted from them the most important religious rites and institutions of society. Aristotle in the work Metaphysics. Egypt was the cradle of mathematics. They devoted themselves to the study of geometry. They'll tell you themselves, right? Okay, so public schools still teach Africa has no history, right? And what they show us is that Africa is just a random hut in the middle of a savanna with skinny children. You know, they just teach us that it's all barbarian. In fact, So many people don't even know that Egypt is in Africa because of how much they try to change the perception of Africa and say that Africa has no history. They're labeled primitive, right? It's a label assigned to ultra sophisticated tech cultures, right? Oh, they're primitive, but we have Kemet, we have Great Zimbabwe, we have the Benin Walls, we have the Olmec heads, we have Timbuktu, right? So much technology in Africa. And the curse narrative was pushed to break the generational memory, right? If we enslave the people and we take away their language and their culture and their knowledge and their learning and they don't know it anymore and we can continue to say it's ours. It forced assimilation into these Japheth empires, and they get to steal the tools while shaming the carriers of the knowledge, right? Nuts. The bloodline, however, still remembers, right? That genetic memory persists in diasporan dreamers and engineers. I was just having a conversation with well, it's a conversation we have a lot, that when you look at technology that FBA or ADOS people create, it's amazing, right? That technology. When you look at even technology that's being created in Africa, like the entire continent of Africa. Like you look at, how did the astronauts go to the moon? Well, because of these Black female mathematicians. This technology is wild, right? It's amazing. So these people who dream of something and then they engineer it. We were just watching a video of a young Black gentleman who was reverting old plastic back into fuel, diesel fuel that could run a vehicle. Isn't that amazing? The memory persists in sacred rituals disguised as superstitions. These are just superstitions. And young Black minds drawn to coding, healing, building, technology, all of these things. Today's Hamites and people who hold Hamite mixture are tinkerers. People who love to tinker, inventors, energy workers, and engineers of the modern systems, right? That covenant that was originally made that got us to Kemet, it wasn't broken, it was buried, right? Because Japheth's line wanted it all. And it's likely true, the covenant that was spirited away in the Ark of the Covenant. That's why I said, watch that CIA show. But now the builders, the Hamites, the builders, the Japhites, the prophets, the Shemites, and the technologists, the Hamites, are starting to get it and figure out who they are, which is one of the biggest threats to the empire. So thank you for listening to me today. There is going to be a bonus video. The editing of it is not fantastic, but I think you'll like it. I think you will like it. But before I go, I want to say that next Sunday, the show is The Fish People, and that includes the Dogon. Okay, the Dogon are considered fish people, but it also includes the Pope of the Catholic Church with some stolen tech. So we're going to talk about the fish people next Sunday. This Wednesday, we're going to continue with the Book of Knowledge, the Keys of Enoch. So if I don't see you this Wednesday, I hope I see you next Sunday. I'm going to play the bonus video, and then I'll show you a picture of my dog. I love you. I miss you. And you're my favorite.
Zephaniah or Zephaniah, a Negro Israelite, a son of Cush. Zephaniah means Yahweh hides. Now, Zephaniah's father was named Cushi, and Cushi as an adjective, that means black. In both Hebrew, it means black, and in Greek, it means black. Now, Cushi is an affectionate term for a Negro of Ethiopian origin, derived from the biblical land of Cush. and it is an area that was alongside the Niger River. And if you actually look at ancient maps in 1736 and ancient maps in 1747 of Africa, you'll find a country called Negro Land and the Kingdom of Judah. This is of utmost importance for us to understand how Yahweh is gathering the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. Because what actually happened is in this Gulf of Guinea in Western Africa, European slave ship holders, they were Ashkenazi slavers. They were of European origin. They were Western Mongols that had infiltrated Britain and mainly Portugal. They were the Ashkenazi slavers. They were wealthy merchant slavers that went down to the coast of Guinea. They employed Mohammedan trappers, Islamics, to go into the kingdom of Judah and Negro land and take the royal house of Judah captive in slave ships, as it's recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, and bring them over to America, and they became known today as what? African Americans.
How were Jews described in Europe before Ashkenazis became the majority? From Nature, Knows No Color Line by J.A. Rogers, page 123. Quote, Waite says, an interesting gradation of all shades down to the black is exhibited by the Jews. Especially dark were the Jews of Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese Jews were very dark, says Pritchard. The Duchesse d'Abrante, wife of Napoleon's ambassador to Portugal, said that the Jew, the Negro, and the Portuguese could be seen in a single person. So dark were the Jews, especially of Portugal and southern Spain, that many whites thought all Jews were black or dark. Another source can be found from The Natural History of Man by James Cowles Pritchard. Quote, the Jews of Portugal are very dark. More corroborating evidence can be found from the memoirs of the Secret Services of John Mackay, Esquire, published in 1733. Daniel, Earl of Nottingham, Secretary of State, is eldest son to Mr. Finch, Lord Chancellor in the reign of King Charles II. He hath also the exterior air of business and application, enough to make him very capable. In his habit and manners very formal. A tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard, or Jew, about 50.
The ancient inhabitants of the ancient peoples of the Middle East were all different types of black people, different groups of black people. Assyrians were a black people, Persians were a black people, Elamites were a black people, and Arabs, yes, were a black people. That's why you see Assyrians have depicted themselves with curly hair, curly beard, and dreadlocks. That's why you see Persians have depicted themselves with curly hair and curly beard. And even there are many wall paintings found in Susa in which Persians have depicted themselves with black skin, have painted themselves with black skin. So therefore, Persians were black people, not a so-called Indo-European, They weren't a white people. Why? Because the temperature here in this city goes up to 50 degrees Celsius in summers with a high intensity and a UV index of 12. White people cannot endure this heat. They cannot tolerate this heat. So they cannot be indigenous to this region. Because we semi-white looking people cannot stand this heat. We cannot go outside too much in summers. But how can white people be indigenous to this region?
Now, we learned in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We also learned in 1619 that the Anglo-Saxon pilgrims came over here looking for religious freedom. In both cases, we were taught that they were met by these people who were the indigenous of America. But that's not entirely true. According to Giovanni de Verrazzano, the people that were found here were black in color, not unlike the Ethiopians with thick black hair, not very long. Whoa, and he encountered them in the Carolinas in 1524. That's right around the time Columbus came to these lands. This is further echoed by James Hugo Johnston, who was a professor at the University of Virginia in the 1900s. He says, to the visitor of the South, the physical characteristics of many Negro slaves bore witness to their Indian origin. Whoa! So you're talking about 400 years later, it's still the same sentiment. Wouldn't the Negro know that they were Indians if they were actually indigenous to this land? You see, that's where these guys come into play. Like Melvin Herkovich, he's the one that created the lie that American Negroes come from Africa only. Not to say that African slaves weren't brought over here, but not 4 million. Then Walter Plecker here, what did he do? He took away the benefits of the American Negro who were indigenous to this land and gave them to whites and Mexicans. Hence why you have the certain Hollywood Indian type. But this guy right here, Hedgelika, he was a curator of physical anthropology for guess who? The Smithsonian. So he was able to change the imagery of the indigenous. And he made all these changes with the stroke of a pen. But see, there's the reason I mentioned that he worked for the Smithsonian.
This is the Bat Creek stone. It was found during the course of an official Smithsonian evacuation. The Smithsonian didn't understand the meaning of the writing on the stone. They thought it was Cherokee since it came from Cherokee country. They didn't realize that it's actually Hebrew.
So you're telling me that the indigenous people of this land, the Mesoamericans, were not only black, but they were Hebrews?
Not the first person to suggest there were Africans in America before Columbus. Christopher Columbus is the first person to say that. He actually says in the Journal of the Second Voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come from the south and southeast trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus may or may not have believed, but he actually collected samples of these spears. They were sent back to Spain. They were meticulously, microscopically examined in Spain. And they were found to be identical, not just similar, identical with spears being forged in African Guinea, of 32 parts, 80 more of gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. Not only were they identical metallurgically, the words the Africans were using for these spears were the words the Americans were using. African word for gold, Ghana.
Traveled extensively around. This is gonna blow your mind. This is the real Tartarian original family lineage. Okay, this is going back really far. We're looking at like 11th, 12th century. That is still, I think, the Habsburg War. It's amazing. The shield. The shield is the same thing. It's the same shield. He's also carrying something that I've seen in China, because I have traveled extensively around East Asian countries, especially Hong Kong and Taiwan. And that is a very important urn that is on top of all the Taoist temples. It's crazy that it actually is also associated with one of the 3 kings that visits Jesus. Incense, I think one of them was gold, incense, frankincense. And this is the Coburg Moor. Must be around the 8th century when Europe was invaded by the Moors, the Tartarians, or the Persians. They built their buildings with mortar, a combination of both empires' names, the Moor and the mortar. Nobody's ever said anything to me about this. I worked this out pretty much myself, so your intuition doesn't matter, your background, your education, your profession is irrelevant. It's intuition, it's genetic memory. So that's the Coburg War. That's one of the three families that combined to create the British monarchy. One of the three families that was combined to create the British monarchy that escaped and went to Europe in the 1800s to escape the revolutions which began in France when everyone got beheaded, and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia when one of the three Tartarian kings was murdered. And everything that has happened since in our modern history, from World War I till today, has happened because one of the three Tartarian kings was killed. Were they all related? Well, are you ready for this? It's gonna get even crazy. I also wanted to show this. There is a lot of disinformation online. This is another one of the original Tartarians, one of the original Moorish Tartarians when they were combined, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, which wasn't in Africa, but I'm not doing that today. Okay, wait a minute, hang on, really? This is the only one that I have seen myself. This is a king of America, probably the first king to ever invade Europe. Yeah.
Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together.